I am Chloe, 35 years old, and until last Sunday, I thought I knew exactly who the monsters in my life were. My mother handed my 13-year-old daughter a locked velvet box after dinner and whispered, "Do not let your mother make a scene about this." When my daughter walked through our front door clutching that box with shaking hands, she was sobbing uncontrollably. I broke the lock. Inside was a cruel letter about her beautiful dark skin, a jar of bleaching cream, and something else entirely. Hidden beneath the cream was a custom diamond pendant that was supposed to have been stolen 3 years ago. It was the exact same pendant that sent an innocent man to federal prison. And tonight, that innocent man would be walking right through my front door. Before I continue this story, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your child from the toxic people in your own bloodline. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how I brought their entire world crashing down. It was a Sunday evening and the house was perfectly quiet. I had intentionally skipped the traditional family dinner at my parents' house. My mother Beatrice had a habit of turning Sunday dinners into a showcase of her elitism and thinly veiled insults, and after a grueling week at work, I simply did not have the energy to endure her passive-aggressive comments. My husband Jamal had taken our daughter Zuri to the dinner instead, promising to bring her home by 8 o'clock. I was sitting at the kitchen island, reviewing some files, enjoying the rare peace. That peace shattered when I heard the heavy front door open. It was only 7 o'clock. I expected to hear Jamal calling out to me, but instead there was only the sound of ragged, heavy breathing. I walked into the foyer and found Zuri standing there alone. My bright, confident 13-year-old girl looked completely broken. Her shoulders were shaking, her face was stained with tears, and she was clutching a small dark blue velvet lockbox against her chest as if it were a bomb. I immediately dropped my pen and rushed over to her, dropping to my knees to meet her eyes. I asked her where her father was. Zuri could barely speak through her tears. She told me Aunt Jasmine had dropped her off at the driveway and sped away, leaving Jamal at the house to talk business with my father. I asked her what happened and why she was crying. Zuri held out the velvet box. Her voice cracked as she told me that Grandma Beatrice had pulled her aside right before dessert. My mother had handed her the locked box, patted her shoulder, and told her it was time she learned her place in this family. The final instruction my mother gave my weeping child was a warning not to let me make a scene about her special gift. Rage, hot and immediate, flared in my chest. I took the box from Zuri. It had a small brass padlock on the front. I did not bother looking for the key. I walked straight to the kitchen drawer, pulled out a heavy metal nutcracker, and smashed the lock until it snapped off. I pulled the lid open fully, expecting one of my mother's typical insults, perhaps a diet book or an etiquette guide. What I found was infinitely worse. Resting on top was a folded piece of heavy cream cardstock. I opened it and read the neat cursive handwriting of my mother. The letter was a vicious colorist attack disguised as grandmotherly advice. Beatrice wrote that Zuri was getting too old to look so unkempt. She wrote that if Zuri ever wanted to look polished and successful like her Aunt Jasmine, she needed to fix her natural hair immediately. The letter went on to say that the world is hard on dark girls, and that Zuri needed to put in the extra effort to lighten up her image if she ever wanted a good man to look her way. My stomach turned. I looked back inside the box and saw the physical manifestation of my mother's self-hate. It was a heavy glass jar of skin bleaching cream, the kind filled with harsh, toxic chemicals. The smell of sulfur and artificial perfume wafted up from the velvet interior. My mother had looked at my beautiful, brilliant, dark-skinned daughter and handed her a jar of poison, telling her she was not good enough as she was. I pulled Zuri into my arms and held her tight. I told her fiercely that she was beautiful, that her skin was flawless, and that Grandma was a deeply broken woman who did not know how to love. I held her until her breathing steadied, until the sobbing turned into quiet hiccups. Once I had calmed her down, I sent her upstairs to take a warm bath and wash her face, promising her that I would handle this. When I heard the bathroom door click shut upstairs, I turned my attention back to the velvet box on the kitchen counter. I was going to throw the entire thing into the trash, but as I grabbed the jar of bleaching cream, I noticed the velvet insert at the bottom of the box was crooked. The box felt heavier than it should have. My fingers brushed against the fabric and I realized there was a false bottom. I pried the velvet up fully, intending to throw away whatever else my mother had hidden inside. My breath caught in my throat. The kitchen seemed to spin around me. There, resting on a bed of cheap cotton, was a massive custom-made diamond pendant. The centerpiece was a flawless 2-carat emerald-cut diamond surrounded by a halo of smaller stones set in heavy platinum. I did not just recognize this necklace. I knew its exact weight. I knew its exact appraised value. And I knew the nightmare it had caused. 3 years ago, Jamal claimed this exact pendant, a family heirloom worth $150,000, was stolen from his business office during a late-night burglary. I vividly remembered Jamal pacing our living room, crying about the loss of his legacy. I remembered the massive insurance payout his company received to cover the stolen inventory. But more importantly, I remembered the investigation. The police had found the safe forced open and the security cameras conveniently disabled. A few weeks later, the authorities arrested Julian, Jamal's business partner. Julian was a brilliant, hardworking man who had built the company from the ground up alongside my husband. But the police claimed they found Julian's fingerprints on the disabled security panel, and Jamal testified against him. Jamal stood in a courtroom and swore under oath that Julian must have stolen the pendant to pay off gambling debts. Julian was convicted of felony grand larceny and sent to federal prison for 3 years, his career and life completely ruined. I stood in my kitchen, staring down at the diamonds glittering under the recessed lighting. My hands began to shake, not from sadness, but from a terrifying realization. The pendant had never been stolen. Jamal had faked the robbery. My husband had committed massive insurance fraud and framed an innocent black man, sending him to a concrete cell just to get a payout. And my mother, the woman who had just handed my daughter a box of poison, was somehow holding on to the felony evidence. I realized in that single crushing moment that my entire family was a syndicate of liars and criminals. I did not scream. I did not cry. I picked up my cell phone, dialed 911, and told the dispatcher I needed an officer immediately to collect stolen felony evidence. I gave the emergency dispatcher my address and clearly stated that I had located a high-value stolen item connected to a closed federal fraud case. I told them the item was currently sitting on my kitchen island and that the primary suspect was on his way home. I hung up the phone and slipped it into my pocket. My hands were perfectly steady. The initial shock had entirely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. For 3 years, I had believed my husband was a victim. I had held him while he cried about losing his family legacy. I had budgeted our finances to make up for the supposed losses his business suffered. Now, looking at the glittering diamonds resting against the cheap velvet, I saw the absolute truth. I was married to a predator. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway broke the silence. Headlights swept across the front windows. Jamal was home. I did not move from my spot at the kitchen island. I simply closed the false bottom of the velvet box, leaving only the bleaching cream and the hateful letter visible on top. I wanted to see exactly how he would play this. I wanted to look into his eyes and watch the lies form. The heavy oak door swung open and Jamal marched inside. He looked irritated, loosening his expensive silk tie and tossing his leather briefcase onto the entryway bench. He immediately looked toward the kitchen and sighed loudly, a dramatic display of exhaustion. He had always been an excellent actor. He asked me why Zuri was crying and running up the stairs instead of greeting him. He walked into the kitchen, his polished dress shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Before I could even formulate a response, his eyes landed on the open blue velvet box sitting on the marble counter. He saw the jar of bleaching cream and my mother's handwritten note. He did not look surprised. He did not look angry. He looked entirely inconvenienced. Jamal leaned against the counter, crossing his arms, and immediately launched into his practiced gaslighting routine. He told me to stop being so dramatic over a little makeup. He insisted that my mother only wanted what was best for Zuri and that I was overreacting because of my own unresolved insecurities. He used his calm, deep, authoritative voice. the exact tone he always used to make me feel small and irrational. He actually had the audacity to tell me that if I spent more time focusing on my own appearance instead of my accounting spreadsheets, maybe my mother would not feel the need to step in and fix my daughter. I stood there and let him talk. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I just watched his mouth move, marveling at the absolute ease with which he defended my mother's cruelty. He was so confident in his control over me that he never even bothered to look closer at the box. He assumed I was just the emotional, difficult wife throwing a tantrum over a family disagreement. He told me I needed to apologize to Beatrice tomorrow for leaving the dinner early and making Zuri uncomfortable. I kept my expression entirely blank. I asked him if he really believed that handing a dark-skinned child toxic bleaching cream was just a simple family disagreement. Jamal rolled his eyes, let out a harsh laugh, and turned his back to me to open the refrigerator. He told me I was obsessing over race again and that I needed to grow up. Right at that exact moment, 3 sharp, heavy knocks echoed from the front door. Jamal paused, a water bottle half raised to his lips. He glanced at the digital clock on the oven, which read 7:45. He frowned, clearly annoyed by the late interruption, and muttered something about neighborhood solicitors. He closed the refrigerator and walked briskly toward the foyer. I followed closely behind him, my heart pounding a slow, deliberate rhythm against my ribs. Jamal pulled the front door open, an impatient greeting already forming on his lips. The words died instantly. Standing on our front porch was a uniformed police officer. But it was the man standing directly behind the officer that made the air vanish from the room. It was Julian. Julian looked different than he had 3 years ago. The tailored business suits were gone, replaced by a simple dark jacket and jeans. His face was leaner, his eyes harder, carrying the unmistakable weight of the federal prison time he had unjustly served. But he stood tall, and his gaze locked onto Jamal with a devastating intensity. Jamal took a physical step backward. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The water bottle slipped from his fingers and crashed onto the hardwood floor, spilling water across the expensive rugs he had bought with Julian's stolen life. The officer stepped inside the foyer, a hand resting casually near his duty belt. He stated his name and asked to speak with Chloe regarding the 911 call about recovered felony evidence. Jamal whipped his head around to look at me, sheer panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. He realized I had made the call. He realized I had found something. Before the officer could explain further, I stepped forward and gestured toward the kitchen. I told the officer the item was resting on the kitchen island inside a blue velvet box. Jamal did not wait for the officer to move. He sprinted the few steps into the kitchen, his eyes wildly scanning the marble counter. He saw the box, and this time he tore the false bottom completely out. The platinum and diamond pendant caught the bright overhead kitchen lights, glittering like a pile of broken glass. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Julian walked slowly into the kitchen, his eyes dropping to the necklace he had supposedly stolen. A cold, bitter smile touched the corner of Julian's mouth. He looked at Jamal and asked if the home invaders had suddenly felt guilty and returned the merchandise. Jamal was trapped. The evidence was sitting in his own house. His framed former partner was standing in his kitchen, and the police were waiting for an explanation. I watched him desperately search for a way out. I watched his mind race, calculating the odds, looking for anyone else to sacrifice. He made his choice in a fraction of a second. Jamal turned away from Julian and looked directly at the police officer. He raised his hand, pointed his finger squarely at my chest, and raised his voice in mock devastation. He told the officer that I stole it. He claimed I was the one who orchestrated the robbery 3 years ago, that I had hidden the necklace, and that he had only just discovered it tonight. He looked at me with fake tears forming in his eyes and said he had been trying to cover for my criminal behavior because he loved me, but he could no longer protect a thief. He was throwing the mother of his child to the wolves without a single moment of hesitation, just to save his own skin. The police officer looked from Jamal's shaking, accusing finger to my completely calm face. A heavy silence settled over the kitchen. The officer pulled a small notepad from his breast pocket, and looked back at my husband. He stated very plainly that my story did not add up with Jamal's sudden accusation. The officer pointed out that if I were the mastermind behind a felony heist 3 years ago, I would not be the person who dialed 911 tonight, invited law enforcement into my home, and voluntarily handed over the stolen merchandise. Julian let out a low, dry laugh. He crossed his arms and stared at Jamal with absolute disgust. He asked Jamal if he really thought the police were that stupid, or if he was just so used to lying that he could not stop himself. Jamal's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. He realized instantly that his panicked lie made absolutely no logical sense. The sheer terror in his eyes was almost satisfying to watch. He practically scrambled backward away from the kitchen island, pulling his cell phone from his pocket with trembling hands. He told the officer he was not saying another word without his attorney. He began furiously typing on his screen, his thumbs moving frantically. I knew exactly who he was texting. He was not just calling a lawyer, he was calling his enablers. He was calling the people who had spent my entire life teaching me that I was second best, the people who would do anything to protect the image of their perfect, successful son-in-law. The officer instructed Jamal to sit down on the living room sofa and not to move while he officially processed and bagged the diamond pendant as recovered felony evidence. Julian remained standing in the entryway, watching like a quiet sentinel, ensuring Jamal did not try to run. I simply leaned against the counter and waited. I listened to the muffled sound of the television playing upstairs, grateful that Zuri was safe in her room, away from the pathetic display unfolding below. It took exactly 25 minutes for the cavalry to arrive. I heard the aggressive screech of tires pulling up to the curb, followed by the slamming of multiple car doors. The front door of our home flew open without a knock. In walked my mother, Beatrice, still wearing her immaculate Sunday church suit. Right behind her was my father, Roland, his face flushed with anger. Next came my older sister, Jasmine, her perfect blowout bouncing around her shoulders. And bringing up the rear was her husband, Connor, a wealthy white tech startup founder who always wore a smug expression and a tailored fleece vest. They stormed into the house like they owned it, clearly prepared to do damage control. My mother spotted the police officer and the sealed evidence bag on the counter, but she did not even glance at Julian or ask what was going on. Her eyes locked directly onto me, and her face twisted with a venomous rage. Beatrice marched right up to me, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings. She started screaming that I had finally lost my mind. She pointed at Jamal, who was cowering on the sofa, and demanded to know why I was terrorizing my own husband. She did not ask about the stolen necklace. She did not ask why there was a federal informant in my kitchen. Instead, she loudly declared to the entire room that I had always been bitterly jealous of Jasmine's marriage. She screamed that just because Connor came from old money, and Jamal was currently going through a rough patch with his business, it did not give me the right to tear this family apart out of pure spite. I stared at my mother, completely baffled by her delusion. I asked her if she had lost her vision along with her morals. I pointed to the evidence bag in the officer's hand. I told her Jamal had faked a home invasion, committed insurance fraud, and sent an innocent man to prison, and yet she was standing in my kitchen yelling at me about being jealous. My father, Roland, stepped forward, his jaw tight. He told me to lower my voice and show some respect. He claimed Jamal was a good man who simply made a desperate business decision to provide for our family. He actually tried to justify the framing of Julian, stating that collateral damage happens in the corporate world, and that I was betraying my own community by involving the authorities. Before I could tear my father's disgusting logic apart, Connor stepped into the center of the room. He puffed out his chest, oozing that specific brand of Silicon Valley arrogance and unearned privilege. He completely ignored Julian and approached the police officer, slipping a business card from his pocket. Connor used his loudest, most patronizing voice. He told the officer that there had been a massive misunderstanding and that he had high-powered corporate lawyers on speed dial who could make this entire situation disappear. He implied that the officer was overstepping his jurisdiction by being here. When the officer refused to take the card, Connor turned his condescending gaze on me. He let out a dramatic sigh and ran a hand through his expensive haircut. He told me to calm down and stop being so hysterical. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, the exact look he always gave me at family gatherings. Connor told me I was overreacting because I simply did not understand how high-level assets and corporate insurance policies were managed. He literally called me a simple bookkeeper. He smirked and told me to go upstairs, check on Zuri, and let the men handle this complicated financial misunderstanding. The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. My parents nodded in agreement with him, looking at me as if I were a child throwing a temper tantrum. Jasmine stood by the doorway, checking her reflection in the hall mirror, looking completely bored by the fact that my husband was a criminal. They all thought they had won. They thought they could bully me into retracting my statement, gaslight me into silence, and protect their precious image. I did not back down. I did not shrink myself. I stood up straight, looked Connor dead in the eye, and felt a cold, powerful smile spread across my face. I was about to introduce my family to the woman they had severely underestimated for 35 years. I took a deliberate step toward Connor. His arrogant smirk was still plastered across his face, fully expecting me to back down and submit to his authority. Instead, I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. I looked him up and down, taking in his expensive clothes, bought with stolen money, and told him he was only half right. I did work with financial ledgers, but I was not a simple bookkeeper. I raised my voice just enough to command the entire room and announced that for the past 3 years, I had been working as a senior forensic accountant for the Internal Revenue Service. I turned my gaze toward Jamal, who was still frozen on the living room sofa. I explained to my stunned family that Jamal had begged me to keep my promotion a secret. He had told me that a black man struggling with his business would feel deeply emasculated if his wife publicly out-earned him with a high-ranking federal government position. I had dimmed my own light and hidden my success just to protect his fragile ego. But I was entirely done shrinking myself for a man who would gladly throw me in a prison cell to save his own skin. Connor opened his mouth to speak, but the smug confidence was completely gone from his eyes. I did not give him the chance to interrupt. I looked directly at the police officer, then at Julian, and finally at my mother. I told them that the moment I found that diamond pendant hidden beneath the jar of bleaching cream, I did not just call 911. I used my federal credentials to access the National Registry. I took high-resolution photographs of the diamonds, located the specific laser, engraved serial numbers on the platinum clasp, and emailed the entire file directly to the primary investigators at the Federal Insurance Fraud Bureau. The evidence was already logged. The federal agents were already being mobilized. It was entirely out of their control. The room went dead silent. You could hear the faint crackle of the police officer's radio. The realization that the evidence was already circulating in the federal system hit my family like a physical blow. Beatrice grabbed the edge of the entryway console table to steady herself, her perfect posture crumbling. Roland stood completely rigid, his eyes wide with disbelief. But it was Jasmine who broke first. My perfect golden child sister completely lost her composure, her face contorted with sheer panic. She whirled around and marched right up to Jamal. She did not ask him if he was okay. She did not ask if he was innocent. Instead, she started screaming at the top of her lungs. She demanded to know how he could be so stupid. She yelled that he had promised the insurance money was completely untraceable through his corporate shell companies. Her voice cracked as she screamed, asking how they were supposed to keep funding Connor's tech application now that the federal government was actively looking into the accounts. Hearing those words leave my sister's mouth was like finding the final missing piece of a massive, sickening puzzle. Everything snapped into crystal clear focus. Jamal did not just hide the necklace. He did not just frame Julian out of desperation to save his own failing business. He had intentionally orchestrated the entire fake robbery to secure a massive fraudulent insurance payout. And then he quietly funneled that stolen money straight into my white brother-in-law's failing tech startup. Jamal had stolen from his own wife, stolen from his own daughter, and destroyed an innocent black man's life, all to secretly bankroll Connor and buy his way into my parents' elite approval. I looked at my father, Roland. I asked him if he knew. I asked him if the entire family was in on this pathetic criminal scheme to prop up Connor's fake image of success. My father's face turned a deep, furious shade of purple. Instead of answering my question or showing an ounce of remorse, he resorted to the only tactic he knew: intimidation. Roland stepped aggressively into my space, pointing a shaking finger at my face. He coldly announced that since I was choosing to betray my husband and tear down my own family, I was no longer welcome in this home. He ordered me to pack my bags, leave Zuri with them, and get out of the house immediately. He smugly reminded me that the deed to the property was not in my name, but technically held by a family trust controlled by him, Beatrice, and Jamal. He genuinely thought the threat of sudden homelessness and losing my daughter would force me to drop the charges and beg for their forgiveness. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I simply walked over to my leather work bag resting on the dining room table, pulled out my laptop, and opened it. I typed in my password and turned the bright screen around for my father and Jamal to see. I told my father I was not going anywhere. I explained that 6 months ago I started noticing strange discrepancies in Jamal's financial statements. Trusting my instincts as an auditor, I legally dissolved our joint accounts and began tracing the exact origin of the trust's funding. I tapped the screen, highlighting a series of highlighted bank transfers. I presented irrefutable documentation proving that Jamal had purchased this house by embezzling funds directly from my own private inheritance money, left exclusively to me by my paternal grandmother. I looked my father dead in the eye and delivered the final blow. I informed him that legally the house was 100% mine. Furthermore, by manipulating the deed, he, my mother, and Jamal were all guilty of financial fraud. Nobody was evicting me tonight. But the police were certainly going to be taking a few passengers with them when they left. My father's face went completely slack. The arrogant, booming patriarch who had dictated my entire life was suddenly speechless, staring at the brightly lit laptop screen as if it were a loaded weapon. He looked at my mother, whose perfectly manicured hands were now trembling violently against the edge of the console table. They knew they were caught in a trap of their own making. But the financial dismantling of my family was not quite finished yet. Julian stepped forward from the shadows of the entryway. Until this moment, he had let me control the room, but now it was his turn. He walked slowly toward the living room, unzipping the inside pocket of his dark jacket. He pulled out a thick manila folder and tossed it onto the coffee table right in front of Jamal and Connor. It hit the wood with a heavy, satisfying thud that made my husband flinch. Julian looked at my parents with a cold, hollow smile. He told them he had a lot of free time sitting in a federal prison cell. He did not spend those 3 years staring at the wall feeling sorry for himself. He spent them tracking every single shell company, offshore account, and wire transfer Jamal had ever authorized. Julian looked directly at my mother and asked if she honestly thought a tech startup run by a man with no coding experience and a degree in art history was actually generating millions of dollars in revenue. Connor bristled, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He puffed out his chest again and aggressively told Julian to back off, claiming his company was fully vetted and backed by elite angel investors. I reached down, opened the manila folder, and pulled out the top stack of highlighted bank records. I read the names of those elite angel investors out loud: Beatrice and Roland. I looked at my parents, feeling a mix of absolute disgust and profound pity. Julian's documents proved everything. My parents had quietly drained their entire retirement fund, mortgaged their remaining assets, and funneled every single penny they owned into Connor's failing business. They were so blinded by their own elitism, so desperately eager to maintain the illusion that Jasmine had married into massive white wealth, that they bankrupted themselves to keep Connor's company afloat. And when their retirement money ran dry, they turned a blind eye as Jamal framed an innocent man and pumped stolen insurance money into the exact same sinking ship. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. Jasmine whipped her head around to look at Connor, her eyes wide with fresh horror. She grabbed his arm and demanded to know if it was true. She asked him where all the venture capital money had gone. Connor tried to shake her off, stammering about market fluctuations and temporary cash flow issues. He was sweating now. The confident, wealthy tech genius routine was completely dissolving in front of our eyes. Right at that exact moment, the heavy silence in the room was shattered by a sharp, vibrating ring. It was Connor's cell phone. He yanked it out of his fleece vest pocket, ready to decline the call and continue his pathetic excuses. But he stopped dead when he saw the caller identification on the screen. All the remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His hand began to shake so violently he almost dropped the device. I leaned against the kitchen island, crossed my arms, and let a slow, satisfied smile spread across my face. I asked him if he was going to answer that. I told him he really should not ignore the Securities and Exchange Commission. Connor looked at me in absolute terror. His voice broke as he asked me what I had done. I kept my voice dead calm and perfectly even. I reminded him that using stolen corporate insurance money across state lines to fund a fraudulent tech company was not just a minor misunderstanding, it was a massive federal crime. I told him I had filed the official whistleblower report with the SEC yesterday morning, complete with Jamal's transfer logs and the offshore account routing numbers. I smiled and said I was pretty sure those high-powered corporate lawyers he bragged about were going to be very busy trying to keep him out of a federal penitentiary. The realization hit the room like a bomb. They were entirely broke, their assets were frozen, and federal investigators were already breathing down their necks. That was when my mother completely lost her mind. The polished church-going facade shattered into a million pieces. Beatrice lunged forward, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. But she did not attack Jamal for lying. She did not attack Connor for squandering her retirement. She turned all her venom directly onto me. She started screaming that I had destroyed the family legacy. She yelled that I was a bitter, vindictive snake who was too stubborn and difficult to ever be a good wife. And then, cornered and desperate, she went right back to the exact same vile cruelty that started this entire nightmare. She pointed upstairs toward Zuri's room and screamed that I was ruining everything just because I was angry that my daughter was too dark and ugly to ever succeed in the real world. She yelled that I should have been grateful she tried to fix Zuri because nobody would ever want a family that looked like us. The air left my lungs. The sheer, unhinged racism and self-loathing pouring out of my own mother's mouth was sickening. Jamal flinched. Even my father looked momentarily shocked by the raw venom in her voice. I did not yell back. I did not need to. I moved with a sudden, terrifying speed, stepping right into my mother's personal space. I towered over her, backing her up against the wall. The police officer immediately stepped forward, ready to intervene, but I held up a single hand to stop him. I looked down into my mother's eyes and delivered my final ultimatum. I told her she had exactly 24 hours to sign full uncontested custody of the remaining family trust back over to me. I told her if she hesitated for a single second, or if she ever spoke about my daughter's beautiful skin again, I would personally hand the rest of the unredacted financial ledgers to the federal agents waiting outside. I promised her that I would ensure she and my father went to prison right alongside Jamal for conspiracy and money laundering. Beatrice's mouth snapped shut. The fight completely left her body. She looked into my eyes and finally realized I was not the weak, obedient scapegoat she had bullied for 3 decades. I was the one holding the match, and her entire world was covered in gasoline. Connor stepped deliberately into the center of the room, positioning himself directly between the police officer and Jamal. He adjusted the collar of his expensive custom-tailored fleece vest, radiating the specific brand of Silicon Valley arrogance that assumed money and complexion could buy a way out of any consequence. He puffed out his chest and set his sights on Julian first. Connor marched right up to Julian, attempting to use his height and aggressive body language to physically intimidate him. He invaded Julian's personal space, pointing a rigid finger at his chest. Connor loudly demanded to know why a convicted felon was standing in his family's home, threatening his brother-in-law. He tried to speak with the booming authority of a chief executive giving an order to a subordinate. Julian did not even blink. He did not step back. He simply looked down at Connor's shaking finger, let out a slow, dry chuckle, and met Connor's eyes with a gaze so cold and hardened by federal prison that Connor actually swallowed hard and took a half step backward. Julian did not need to raise his voice or puff out his chest. His absolute fearlessness completely dismantled Connor's attempt at intimidation in a matter of seconds. Realizing he could not bully Julian, Connor immediately pivoted toward the police officer. He reached into his pocket and produced a sleek, matte black business card, holding it out with a practiced, arrogant smile. He shifted his tone, attempting to establish an unspoken alliance of authority. He introduced himself as the founder and chief executive officer of a revolutionary tech startup. Connor told the officer that this entire situation was nothing more than a domestic misunderstanding blown wildly out of proportion by an emotional wife. He dropped the names of his elite investors and casually mentioned that he had a team of high-powered corporate lawyers on speed dial. He explicitly warned the officer that if he did not leave the premises and drop this ridiculous investigation immediately, those lawyers would bury the police department in civil rights lawsuits before morning. The police officer did not take the business card. He kept his hands resting calmly near his utility belt and stared blankly at Connor. He politely but firmly informed Connor that he was currently interfering with an active federal crime scene, and that if he did not step aside, he would be placed in handcuffs for obstruction of justice. The threat of actual consequences rattled Connor. The smug confidence began to crack, replaced by a deep defensive frustration. Since his wealth and status were entirely failing to control the men in the room, he turned his sights onto the target he had always considered the weakest. He turned his attention to me. Connor walked over to where I was standing by the kitchen island. He let out a loud theatrical sigh, rubbing his temples as if my very existence was a massive inconvenience to his busy schedule. He looked me up and down with an expression of pure condescension. When he spoke, he slowed his words down and lowered his voice, adopting the patronizing tone one might use to explain a simple concept to a confused child. He told me that he understood I was upset about whatever petty argument Jamal and I had gotten into, but that I was letting my female emotions completely cloud my rational judgment. He gestured vaguely toward the velvet box on the counter. He said I was clearly confused about the necklace and the insurance claims because I simply did not have the educational background to comprehend how the corporate world operated. Connor looked down his nose at me and actually laughed. He reminded the room that I was just a bookkeeper. He said my job was to tally receipts and balance basic spreadsheets for local small businesses. He told me that high-level corporate assets, liability policies, and structured insurance payouts were entirely out of my depth. He claimed I was embarrassing Jamal, embarrassing my parents, and making a fool of myself by involving the authorities in matters I did not understand. My mother Beatrice nodded enthusiastically in agreement. My father crossed his arms, looking pleased that Connor had finally put me in my place. Jasmine stood near the doorway, inspecting her manicured nails, completely unbothered by the fact that her husband was insulting her own sister. They all looked at me with varying degrees of pity and disdain, fully expecting me to lower my head, apologize for the disruption, and retreat into the shadows. Connor finished his arrogant speech by pointing toward the staircase. He told me to go upstairs, check on my crying daughter, and let the men in the room handle this complicated financial misunderstanding. He actually reached out and attempted to pat me on the shoulder, a physical dismissal meant to end the conversation entirely. I stepped back before his hand could touch me. I did not shrink. I did not cry. I stood perfectly still, absorbing the sheer, unadulterated disrespect radiating from my white brother-in-law and the family that worshipped him. I felt a deep, powerful calm wash over my entire body. They had spent my entire life underestimating my intelligence, my worth, and my strength. And in exactly 10 seconds, I was going to systematically destroy the foundation of every single lie they had built their lives upon. I looked at Connor's outstretched hand, then slowly brought my gaze up to meet his condescending blue eyes. I did not raise my voice or break my composure. I simply told him he was absolutely right about one thing. I did work with financial ledgers, but I was not a simple bookkeeper for local mom-and-pop shops. I squared my shoulders and raised my voice just enough so that it echoed against the high ceilings of the foyer, ensuring every single person in the room heard me perfectly. I announced that for the past 3 years, I had been working as a senior forensic accountant for the Internal Revenue Service. The smug smile on Connor's face froze completely. My father blinked rapidly, visibly struggling to process the words I had just spoken. My mother's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The sheer shock of realizing they had been insulting a federal investigator in her own home anchored them to the floor. I turned my attention to Jamal, who was still practically melting into the cushions of the living room sofa, his face buried in his hands. I explained to my stunned family exactly why they were so severely misinformed about my career. I told them that when I received my massive federal promotion complete with a top-tier security clearance and a salary that dwarfed his own, Jamal had practically begged me to keep it a secret from the family. He had looked me in the eye and manipulated my empathy, telling me that a black man struggling to keep his business afloat would feel deeply emasculated if his wife publicly out-earned him with a high-ranking government position. I confessed to the room that I had dimmed my own light. I had hidden my success, downgraded my job title in casual conversation, and played the role of the quiet, unremarkable wife just to protect his incredibly fragile ego. I did it because I believed in supporting my husband through his hardships. But I told them I was entirely done shrinking myself for a man who would gladly throw me into a prison cell to save his own skin. Connor opened his mouth to speak, but the arrogant confidence was completely gone from his eyes. He looked suddenly small in his expensive fleece vest. I did not give him the chance to form an excuse or launch another insult. I looked directly at the police officer, then at Julian, and finally settled my stare back on Connor. I told him that those high-powered corporate lawyers he had just bragged about were not going to be able to help him out of this specific situation. I explained that the moment I found that diamond pendant hidden beneath my mother's jar of skin-bleaching cream, I did not just dial 911 to report a local theft. I detailed exactly what my actual profession allowed me to do. I told them I had immediately used my federal credentials to log into the secure national registry. I had taken high-resolution photographs of the diamonds under the kitchen lighting. I had located the specific laser-engraved serial numbers on the platinum clasp cross, referenced them with the stolen property database, and drafted an urgent comprehensive fraud report. I watched the color completely drain from Jamal's face as I delivered the final crushing detail. I informed the room that before anyone had even arrived at my house, I had already emailed that entire file directly to the primary investigators at the Federal Insurance Fraud Bureau. I smiled at Connor, a cold, hard smile that finally made him take a physical step backward. I informed him that the evidence was already permanently logged in the federal database. The federal agents were already being mobilized and warrants were likely being drafted as we spoke. I told him this was no longer a local domestic dispute that he could wave away with a sleek business card and a few empty threats. It was an active federal crime scene, and it was entirely out of his control. The room went dead silent. The quiet was so absolute that the only sound was the faint static crackle of the police officer's shoulder radio. The realization that the evidence was already circulating in the highest levels of the federal justice system hit my family like a physical blow. The smug arrogance that had filled the room just moments ago completely evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing terror. My mother grabbed the edge of the entryway console table to steady herself, her perfect posture completely crumbling under the weight of the revelation. My father stood rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes darting frantically between me and the police officer. But it was Jasmine who broke first. The reality of federal involvement tore through her facade of boredom. The perfect golden child sister completely lost her composure. Her face contorted with sheer panic, and she whirled around, marching right up to where Jamal was sitting on the sofa. Jasmine grabbed Jamal by the collar of his expensive dress shirt and shook him. She completely abandoned her refined country club persona, her voice cracking as she screamed at the top of her lungs. She demanded to know how he could be so incredibly stupid. She yelled that he had promised the insurance money was completely untraceable through his corporate shell companies. Her face was red and blotchy as she shrieked, asking how they were supposed to keep funding Connor's tech application now that the federal government was actively looking into the accounts. Connor lunged forward and grabbed Jasmine by the arm, roughly pulling her away from Jamal. He hissed at her to shut her mouth, his eyes darting frantically toward the police officer and then back to me. He realized instantly that his wife had just loudly confessed to receiving stolen federal funds in front of a senior forensic accountant and a sworn member of law enforcement. But the damage was already done. The truth was out in the open, hanging in the air like thick smoke. I stood perfectly still as the massive, sickening puzzle pieces snapped flawlessly into place in my mind. The realization hit me so hard it almost knocked the breath from my lungs. Jamal did not just hide the necklace. He did not just frame Julian out of a desperate, panicked attempt to save his own failing business. It was so much worse and so much more calculated than that. Jamal had intentionally orchestrated the entire fake robbery to secure a massive cash payout from the insurance company. And then instead of using that money to repair his business or support our family, he quietly funneled every single cent of it into my white brother-in-law's failing tech startup. I looked at my husband, who was now cowering on the sofa, and I finally understood his true motive. Despite his arrogant posturing, Jamal had always been deeply insecure. He was desperate for my parents' elite approval. My mother and father worshipped Connor because Connor represented the white old money aesthetic they so desperately wanted to be associated with. But behind closed doors, Connor was an absolute fraud. His tech company was bleeding money and he was on the verge of total bankruptcy. Jamal saw an opportunity to become the savior. He bought his way into my parents' good graces by stealing from his own family and destroying an innocent black man's life. He sent Julian, his own business partner and friend, to a federal penitentiary, all so he could bankroll Connor's fake image of success. Jamal had traded his morality, his freedom, and another man's life just to buy a seat at my mother's Sunday dinner table. I spoke the truth out loud, my voice cutting through the chaotic shouting of my sister and brother-in-law. I detailed exactly what Jamal had done, laying out the timeline of the fraud, the wire transfers, and the ultimate betrayal. I explained how my husband had smiled in my face, slept in my bed, and complained about our tight household budget, all while actively feeding hundreds of thousands of dollars of stolen money to a man who literally looked down on me. Connor immediately went on the defensive. He threw his hands up in the air and loudly proclaimed that he had no idea the investment money was stolen. He pointed an accusatory finger at Jamal, claiming that Jamal had approached him as an independent angel investor. Connor stated that his hands were clean and that he was a legitimate businessman who had simply been duped by a common criminal. Jamal snapped. The fear in his eyes morphed into a wild, cornered rage. He jumped up from the sofa and yelled right back at Connor. Jamal revealed that Connor had literally begged him for a cash injection. Jamal screamed that Connor had come to him crying, admitting that his venture capital funding had dried up and that his expensive home was about to go into foreclosure. The two men who had spent the last 3 years pretending to be the pillars of perfection were now viciously tearing each other apart, eager to throw the other under the bus to save themselves. I turned my attention away from the pathetic argument and looked directly at my parents. My mother Beatrice was staring at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. My father Roland had his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. I asked my father a very simple question. I asked him how long he had known. The silence that followed was deafening. My father did not act surprised by the revelation of the stolen money. He did not ask Jamal for an explanation or express any shock. He simply adjusted his posture, refusing to look at Julian, the man whose life had been ruined to keep my family wealthy. My father finally spoke, and his words made my blood run entirely cold. Roland tried to justify the crime. He used his deep, authoritative voice to calmly explain that the corporate world is complicated and that collateral damage is sometimes necessary to protect the greater good of the family. He actually looked me in the eye and said Jamal had made a difficult but necessary business decision to ensure Jasmine and Connor did not lose their home. My father told me I was betraying my own community by involving the authorities and trying to destroy the family's hard-earned reputation over a simple financial mistake. A simple financial mistake. That is what my father called sending an innocent man to prison and stealing federal funds. They had all known. My parents had actively covered for Jamal's crimes because it kept their golden child daughter living in a mansion and driving a luxury car. They were all complicit, bound together by their greed, their elitism, and their complete lack of basic human decency. Julian stepped forward from the entryway, a cold, dark smile spreading across his face. He looked at my father and let out a dry, bitter laugh. He told my father that the federal government does not recognize the protection of a family's reputation as a valid defense for grand larceny and wire fraud. My father's face turned a deep, furious shade of purple. He realized that logic, intimidation, and family loyalty were completely failing to control me. I was not backing down, and the police officer was still standing in the kitchen radioing for backup units. So my father resorted to the absolute last weapon he believed he had in his arsenal. He decided to use the ultimate threat to force my submission. He took a heavy step toward me, his eyes narrowing with a ruthless, calculated cruelty, preparing to pull the rug completely out from under my life. My father looked down at me with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He adjusted his suit jacket, cleared his throat, and completely dropped the facade of the concerned, rational patriarch. He told me that if I was going to stand in my own kitchen and threaten the freedom of my husband, my brother-in-law, and my parents, then I had officially forfeited my place in this family. He pointed a rigid finger toward the front door and ordered me to pack whatever clothes I could fit into a single suitcase and get off his property by midnight. I stared at him, letting a few seconds of heavy silence pass. I reminded my father that this was my home. I told him that my name was on the mortgage documents we signed 7 years ago, and he had absolutely no legal authority to kick me out into the street. Roland let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed off the foyer walls. It was a cold, humorless sound. He looked at Jamal, who was still sitting on the sofa, and then back to me with a devastating smirk. My father informed me that I was severely mistaken about the ownership of this property. He told me that 3 years ago, right around the time Jamal began facing financial difficulties, they had made some quiet administrative changes to protect our assets. Roland explained, using his slow, patronizing tone, that Jamal had transferred the deed of this house into a private family trust. He smugly revealed that the only legal controllers of that trust were himself, my mother, Beatrice, and Jamal. My name had been entirely removed from the property records. According to the law, as my father so happily pointed out, I was nothing more than a temporary guest in a house owned by the family trust, and my invitation had just been permanently revoked. The room seemed to hold its breath. Connor and Jasmine exchanged a look of profound relief, the smug arrogance slowly returning to their faces. They truly believed the old man had just saved them. Jamal sat up a little straighter on the sofa, brushing a piece of lint off his trousers. He looked at me with a pathetic mixture of guilt and triumph, hiding behind my father's power, because he had none of his own. My mother Beatrice decided this was the perfect moment to twist the knife even deeper. She stepped out from behind my father, smoothing down her pristine skirt, and looked at me with an expression of pure venom masked as maternal concern. She told me that I did not need to worry about packing any of Zuri's belongings. Beatrice calmly announced that a woman who was actively trying to send her own husband to federal prison was clearly suffering from a severe psychological breakdown. She looked directly at the police officer, who was silently observing the exchange with his hand near his radio, and claimed that I was an unfit mother experiencing a dangerous manic episode. Beatrice declared that Zuri would be staying right here in this house in her own bedroom, under the legal guardianship of her father and her loving grandparents. She told me that if I tried to take my daughter with me, they would immediately call Child Protective Services, report me for kidnapping, and use Jamal's fabricated story of my mental instability to ensure I never saw my child again. I glanced up toward the ceiling. I could hear the faint sound of Zuri's television playing in her bedroom. The thought of leaving my brilliant, beautiful daughter in the hands of a woman who had just gifted her a jar of skin bleaching cream made my blood run cold. They were trying to legally render me homeless, strip me of my financial assets, and steal my child all in one coordinated, ruthless strike. They expected me to fall to my knees. They expected me to panic, to cry, and to beg for forgiveness. They assumed I would drop the federal charges and fall back in line to protect my relationship with my daughter. For 35 years, this was exactly how they had controlled me. They manufactured crises, isolated me, and then offered conditional safety only if I submitted to their absolute authority. Julian shifted his weight in the entryway. He looked at me, a silent question in his hardened eyes, ready to intervene if I needed him. But I gave him a small, almost imperceptible shake of my head. I did not need saving. I did not fall to my knees. I did not shed a single tear. I felt the steady, reassuring weight of the federal credentials inside my bag resting on the counter. I felt the absolute certainty of the financial ledgers I had meticulously compiled over the last 6 months. They had just confidently played their ultimate trump card, completely unaware that I was holding the entire deck. I looked at Jamal. I asked him if he really thought he was smart enough to quietly transfer the deed of our primary residence without a senior forensic accountant noticing the discrepancy in our annual tax filings. Jamal's brief moment of confidence vanished instantly. His jaw went slack, and his eyes darted nervously toward my father. I turned my attention back to Roland. I told him he was absolutely correct that the house was technically held in a family trust. I agreed that the paperwork he and Jamal had forged 3 years ago looked very official on the surface. But I reminded my father that I did not just audit small businesses. I dismantled complex federal financial crimes for a living. I told him that creating a trust is only the very first step. To legally maintain ownership of a property and protect it from federal seizure, the trust must be funded with clean, traceable capital. I walked over to my leather work bag, reached inside, and pulled out my laptop. I set it down on the kitchen island and opened the screen, typing in my secure password. The bright glow of the monitor illuminated the kitchen, casting long shadows across the faces of my family members. I did not need to raise my voice. The quiet, absolute authority in my tone was more terrifying than any scream could ever be. I looked at my father, tapped the keyboard, and told him it was time for a quick lesson in high-level asset management. The brightly lit screen illuminated the faces of my family, casting long, harsh shadows across the kitchen. I told my father to look very closely at the dates, the routing numbers, and the highlighted transfer logs. I explained that my investigation into Jamal did not begin tonight with a velvet box and a stolen diamond pendant. It started 6 months ago. I told them how I had started noticing small, insidious changes, unexplained cash withdrawals, hidden credit card statements, and Jamal's sudden aggressive insistence that we needed to tighten our household budget, despite his constant bragging at family dinners about his company's massive success. Because I catch financial criminals for a living, I did not ignore my instincts or let him gaslight me into thinking I was just being a paranoid wife. I quietly and legally dissolved our joint bank accounts and began running a full forensic audit on my own husband. I tapped the keyboard, pulling up the foundational documents of the precious family trust my father had just tried to use as a weapon to render me homeless. I looked my father dead in the eye and told him that establishing a trust requires an initial verifiable injection of capital. My father nodded slowly, his eyes glued to the numbers on the screen. He was still arrogant enough to believe he was legally insulated. He puffed out his chest and claimed that Jamal provided the capital from his corporate profits to protect the family from liability. I let out a short, cold laugh. I told my father that Jamal's company had not generated a single dollar of actual legitimate profit in over 4 years. I scrolled down to the next document on the screen. I showed them the exact origin of the $300,000 used to fund the family trust and purchase this house. The money did not come from Jamal's business. It did not come from my parents' accounts. It came from an account legally registered only in my name. I watched my mother's eyes widen as the terrifying realization struck her. I explained that the money was my private inheritance, left exclusively to me by my paternal grandmother before she passed away. It was a protected asset completely separate from my marital finances, meant to secure my future. But Jamal had forged my signature. I brought up the forensic signature analysis on the screen, showing exactly how he had faked my handwriting on a series of power of attorney documents. He had unlawfully authorized a massive wire transfer, completely draining my inheritance into a dummy corporation. Then he funneled those exact stolen funds into the family trust to buy this property, parading around as the successful provider while actively robbing his own wife. Jamal shrank back into the living room sofa, pulling his knees up as if he could physically hide from the digital evidence glaring right at him. I turned my attention back to my father. I explained the federal laws regarding stolen assets in a slow, deliberate voice. I told him that because the family trust was funded exclusively with embezzled money, the trust itself was entirely fraudulent and legally void. According to the law of asset recovery, any property purchased with stolen funds reverts directly back to the victim of the theft. I smiled at my father, savoring the absolute destruction of his pride. I told him that I owned every single square inch of this property. I owned the hardwood floors he was standing on. I owned the roof over his head, and I owned the front door he had just tried to throw me out of. But I was not finished. I watched the remaining color drain from my father's face as I delivered the final devastating detail. I told my father and my mother that their signatures were on those trust documents, right alongside Jamal's. By legally binding themselves to a financial entity built entirely on stolen money, and by claiming ownership of a property bought with embezzled funds, they had unknowingly made themselves accessories to grand larceny and wire fraud. I leaned across the kitchen island, bringing my face just inches from my father's. I dropped my voice to a lethal, icy whisper. I told him that if he ever threatened to take my daughter from me again, or if he ever tried to remove me from my own home, I would print these documents and hand them directly to the federal agents waiting outside. I promised him that at his age, federal prison would not be kind to him. My father literally stumbled backward. The booming, untouchable patriarch who had dictated every aspect of my life was suddenly gasping for air in my kitchen. He looked at Jamal with a mixture of sheer terror and absolute fury. He realized that in Jamal's desperate attempt to buy his way into the family, my husband had essentially strapped a financial bomb to my parents' chests. My mother began to cry. These were not her usual calculated, manipulative tears used to garner sympathy. These were genuine, ugly tears of raw panic. She realized that her pristine social standing, her exclusive country club memberships, and her perfect church-going image were hovering over an absolute abyss. She had tied her entire legacy to a man who had just handed her a one-way ticket to a federal indictment. Connor stood frozen near the hallway. His arrogant tech founder persona was completely obliterated. He was realizing that not only was he going down for the stolen insurance money, but the family he had relied on to bail him out was just as legally ruined as he was. Jasmine was simply staring at the wall, her perfect life unraveling faster than her mind could comprehend. They had stormed into my home expecting to find a broken, hysterical woman they could easily bully into silence. Instead, they found a federal investigator who had methodically dismantled their entire lives without breaking a sweat. But the financial execution was not quite over. I had exposed Jamal's theft of my inheritance and his insurance fraud, but there was still one more devastating secret left to uncover. The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. My father was staring at the floor, a broken man who had just realized his absolute authority was completely gone. But the final nail in the coffin was not going to come from me. It was going to come from the man my family had treated as acceptable collateral damage. Julian stepped fully into the light of the kitchen. He had stood silently near the entryway for most of the evening, letting me systematically dismantle my husband and my father. Now the hardened former executive walked slowly toward the kitchen island. He reached inside his dark jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. He did not hand it to the police officer. He slid it across the marble counter directly to me. Julian looked at my parents. His voice was incredibly calm, but it carried a sharp edge that commanded the entire room. He told my father that federal prison is a very isolating place. He said that when you are locked in a concrete cell for 3 years for a crime you did not commit, you have two choices. You can let the anger completely consume you, or you can get to work. Julian told my parents he chose to get to work. He spent every single day in the prison law library using his allotted phone calls to contact old financial associates, pulling public records and meticulously tracking every single corporate shell company Jamal had ever registered. I opened the folder. Inside was a massive stack of financial documents, bank statements, and corporate tax returns. But the names at the top of these specific ledgers did not belong to Jamal. They belonged to my parents. I started flipping through the pages, my eyes rapidly scanning the highlighted numbers. I felt a wave of absolute disbelief wash over me. I looked up at my mother, who now had her hands pressed tightly over her mouth. I looked at my father, whose chest was heaving with panicked, shallow breaths. I asked them what they had done. Julian answered for them. He pointed at the documents and told the room that Jamal was not the first person to funnel money into Connor's failing tech startup. Julian revealed that long before Jamal faked the robbery and stole the insurance money, Beatrice and Roland had completely bankrupted themselves to keep Connor afloat. I read the documents out loud for everyone to hear. The records showed that 2 years ago, my parents had quietly liquidated their entire retirement portfolio. They had taken out a massive second mortgage on their fully paid-off home. They had even cashed out the life insurance policies they had held since I was a child. They took every single penny of their generational wealth and handed it directly to Connor under the guise of an angel investment. I stared at my parents, completely sickened by their delusion. I demanded to know why they would risk everything they had ever worked for on a man who had zero coding experience and a degree in art history. But I already knew the answer. We all knew the exact answer. My parents were entirely blinded by their own deeply ingrained elitism and their toxic obsession with proximity to whiteness. Connor was white. He came from a family that had once possessed old money, and he used all the right Silicon Valley buzzwords. My parents had spent their entire lives trying to distance themselves from their own community, desperate to be accepted by the upper crust of society. They looked at Connor and saw a golden ticket. They genuinely believed that his skin color and his arrogant confidence guaranteed him massive financial success. They assumed he could not fail simply because he looked exactly like the men they had always been taught to idolize. So they threw their life savings into his empty shell of a company. And Connor took their money, bought expensive cars, hosted lavish networking parties, and completely squandered every single dime without producing a single working application. I laid the final bank statement on the counter and explained the timeline to the room. When my parents realized Connor had lost all their money, they were facing absolute financial ruin. They were about to lose their home, their country club memberships, and the flawless image they had spent decades cultivating. They were terrified and desperate. That was the exact moment Jamal saw his opportunity. Jamal knew my parents were broke. He knew they would rather die than let their high society friends know they had been conned by their golden white son-in-law. So Jamal executed the fake robbery. He framed Julian, collected the massive insurance payout, and started quietly paying my parents' mortgage and country club dues with the stolen federal funds. He bought his way into the position of the favored son-in-law, and my parents gladly looked the other way because they were too cowardly to admit they had destroyed their own legacy. My mother let out a loud, pathetic sob. She sank down onto one of the dining chairs, covering her face as the reality of her complete financial ruin was laid bare. She was utterly broke. The expensive clothes she was wearing, the luxury car she drove, the food she ate at her exclusive Sunday brunches, it was all paid for with blood money. Jasmine whipped her head around and stared at Connor. Her perfect manicured facade was completely shattered. She grabbed the collar of his fleece vest and screamed at him. She demanded to know if it was true. She asked him if he had really taken her parents' retirement fund and lost every last cent of it. Connor tried to step away from her, his face pale and sweating profusely. He stammered, raising his hands in a defensive gesture. He tried to claim that startups are inherently risky and that he had simply hit a temporary market downturn. He arrogantly stated that he was on the verge of securing new venture capital and that he just needed a little more time to turn a massive profit. He actually had the nerve to look at Julian and say that financial loss was just part of the corporate game. Julian took a slow step toward Connor. He did not yell. He did not threaten him. He just looked at him with a level of absolute disgust that made Connor flinch. Julian told Connor that playing a game with venture capital is one thing, but sitting back and watching an innocent black man go to a federal penitentiary just so you can keep driving a leased sports car is the action of a pathetic coward. Julian promised Connor that the federal agents actively investigating the fraud would not be impressed by his excuses. I looked at my family, a group of people who had spent my entire childhood telling me I was not good enough, not smart enough, and not polished enough to represent their legacy. They had humiliated my daughter just hours ago because she did not fit their twisted, colorist standards. Now they were standing in my kitchen entirely exposed. They had sacrificed their morality, their wealth, and another man's freedom, all to maintain a pathetic illusion of superiority. And they had absolutely nothing left to show for it. Right on cue, the heavy silence in the kitchen was shattered by a sharp, aggressive ringtone. The sound was coming from the pocket of Connor's expensive fleece vest. He flinched violently as if the device had physically burned him. He reached into his pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out his sleek smartphone. Connor stared down at the brightly lit screen. I watched as every single drop of blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. His mouth opened slightly, but his vocal cords seemed completely paralyzed. He tried to press the side button to silence the call, but his hands were shaking so uncontrollably that he nearly dropped the phone onto the hardwood floor. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. I crossed my arms and let a wide, genuinely satisfied smile spread across my face. I asked him if he was going to answer that. I told him it was considered very bad for business to ignore calls from Washington District of Columbia. Connor slowly raised his eyes from the screen to look at me. The sheer, unadulterated terror in his gaze was magnificent. His voice was nothing more than a hollow, breathless rasp when he asked me how I knew who was calling. I kept my voice perfectly level, savoring the absolute destruction of his arrogant tech founder persona. I asked him if I had forgotten to mention my morning schedule from the previous day. I explained that before I went to work, and long before I sat down to audit my own husband, I made a very important phone call to a colleague of mine. I looked at Connor and delivered the final blow. I told him that moving stolen corporate insurance money across state lines to secretly fund an unregistered shell company is not just a minor financial faux pas. It is a massive multi-tiered federal crime. I informed him that I had compiled a 500-page dossier detailing every single fraudulent wire transfer Jamal had ever sent to his company accounts. And then at exactly 8 o'clock yesterday morning, I filed a comprehensive whistleblower report directly with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Connor let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. The phone finally slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor, the screen cracking against the wood. It continued to ring, a relentless vibrating alarm signaling the end of his entire life. I did not stop there. I wanted him to understand exactly how thoroughly he had been dismantled. I told Connor that the SEC does not operate like local law enforcement. They do not send a single patrol officer to ask polite questions. I explained that when a senior IRS forensic accountant hands them a perfectly documented case of interstate wire fraud and stolen venture capital, they move with absolute devastating speed. I pointed to his cracked phone on the floor. I told him that the people calling him right now were not reaching out to schedule a meeting. They were calling to officially inform him that as of this very moment, every single bank account associated with his name, his business, and his social security number had been federally frozen. Jasmine let out a piercing scream. She lunged at Connor, grabbing him by the shoulders. She shook him frantically, demanding to know what this meant for them. She asked about their massive house, their luxury vehicles, and the private school tuition for her future children. I answered her instead of him. I looked my older sister dead in the eye and told her it meant she was completely destitute. I explained that because she had happily signed her name on the joint tax returns legally, verifying Connor's fraudulent income, the federal government viewed her as an active co-conspirator. I told Jasmine that the SEC was going to seize their mansion auction off their cars and liquidate whatever pathetic jewelry she was wearing just to pay back the stolen insurance funds. Jasmine collapsed onto her knees right there in my kitchen. The perfect golden child who had spent her entire life looking down on me was now sobbing hysterically on my floor, realizing she was about to be a broke convicted felon. Connor spun around, his eyes wild with the frantic desperation of a cornered animal. He looked at Julian, then at the police officer, and finally at my father. He practically begged Roland to do something. He reminded my father of all the powerful politicians and judges they played golf with at the country club. He demanded that my father make a few phone calls to shut this down. My father did not move. Roland just stared at Connor with an expression of profound, empty horror. My father finally realized the absolute magnitude of the situation. He could not call his powerful country club friends to save Connor because my father no longer belonged to that world. He had drained his entire retirement and mortgaged his own home to give money to Connor. My father was just as bankrupt as the weeping man standing in front of him. Jamal pressed himself further into the corner of the living room, trying to make himself invisible. He had started this entire chain reaction of destruction by trying to buy his way into a family that was completely hollow on the inside. I stood in the center of the room, flanked by Julian and the police officer, and looked at the absolute wreckage of my toxic family. They had walked into my home 30 minutes ago believing they were untouchable. They had threatened to take my child, steal my house, and force me into submission. Now they had absolutely nothing. No money, no power, no legacy, and absolutely no freedom. But watching their wealth vanish was not enough for my mother. Beatrice had spent her entire life defining her worth by her superiority over others, specifically her superiority over me. Stripped of her money and her golden son-in-law, her mind simply could not process the defeat. She could not accept that the daughter she hated had outsmarted them all. As the reality of her total poverty set in, something dark and dangerous snapped behind my mother's eyes. She slowly stood up from the dining chair, her hands curling into tight fists, preparing to launch the most vicious, deeply personal attack of the entire night. Beatrice's face twisted into something entirely unrecognizable. The polished church-going matriarch vanished completely, replaced by a desperate, cornered woman whose entire identity was evaporating into thin air. Stripped of her wealth and her golden son-in-law, her broken mind simply could not process the defeat. She could not accept that the daughter she had always treated as a disappointment had outsmarted them all. She did not scream at Connor for losing her life savings. She did not yell at Jamal for starting this catastrophic chain of events. Instead, she stepped away from the dining chair, marched directly toward me, and unleashed 3 decades of repressed, venomous hatred. She screamed that I had always been the absolute poison in this family. Her voice was so shrill it vibrated against the glass windows of the living room. Beatrice yelled that from the exact moment I was born, I was entirely too dark, too stubborn, and too difficult to ever fit into the high society life she had painstakingly built. She pointed a trembling accusatory finger at Jasmine, who was still sobbing hysterically on the floor, and screamed that my sister was the only one who did things right. My mother claimed Jasmine understood the assignment of elevating the family bloodline. She yelled that Jasmine married right, that she married into proper wealth and acceptable society, while I was determined to drag them all straight back into the gutter out of pure vindictive jealousy. The shouting had grown so loud and violent that it echoed through the entire house. I heard the faint creak of the floorboards above us and immediately looked up. Zuri was standing at the top of the staircase. She was clutching the wooden banister tightly, her eyes wide with terror, staring down at the absolute chaos consuming our home. My mother followed my gaze. When Beatrice saw her 13-year-old granddaughter standing on the landing, she did not feel a single ounce of shame or maternal protection. Instead, her unhinged mind saw a fresh target. Beatrice pointed directly at Zuri and raised her voice even louder, making sure her words carried up the stairs. She screamed that I was ruining everyone's lives just because I was bitter about how my daughter looked. She yelled that handing Zuri that box of bleaching cream was the only act of true kindness anyone had ever shown her. Beatrice ruthlessly declared that no one in the real world would ever respect or love a girl who looked like that, and that I was a terrible mother for letting my daughter walk around with natural hair and dark skin. The air in the room completely crystallized. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in a fraction of a second. The police officer instinctively took a step forward, his hand dropping to his utility belt, clearly sensing that the vicious verbal assault was about to escalate into physical violence. Julian tensed his shoulders, ready to intervene, but I did not need the police or anyone else to protect my child. I moved faster than I ever thought possible. I crossed the distance between the kitchen island and the staircase in 3 rapid, heavy strides, completely cutting off my mother's line of sight to Zuri. I positioned my body directly in front of the bottom step, becoming an impenetrable physical shield between my brilliant daughter and the toxic woman who had just tried to destroy her soul. I did not scream back. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. The rage coursing through my veins was so absolute, so pure and concentrated that it came out as a dead, chilling calm. The generational trauma was stopping right here tonight on these hardwood floors. I looked down into my mother's manic, bloodshot eyes. I told her to close her mouth. I instructed her to never look at my daughter, speak to my daughter, or even breathe in the general direction of my daughter ever again. Beatrice opened her mouth to argue, still riding the high of her own unhinged adrenaline, but I took 1 half step forward and forced her to retreat. I invaded her space, towering over her, and dropped my voice to a lethal whisper that only she and my father could hear clearly. I told my mother that she was currently standing in a house that I owned completely bankrupt, while a federal investigator held the keys to her freedom. I reminded her that I possessed the unredacted ledgers. I held the fraudulent tax returns, bearing her forged signatures. I told her that if she uttered one more single syllable about my daughter's beautiful, flawless skin, I would not just let the federal government handle her case as a standard financial crime. I stared directly into her eyes and promised her that I would make it my personal mission in life to ensure she spent her final years in a concrete cell. I told her I would see to it that she was completely stripped of her expensive makeup, her tailored suits, and the pathetic false superiority she clung to. I warned her that I would ruin her so permanently and so publicly that her prestigious country club friends would pretend they never even knew her name. The icy, absolute certainty in my voice finally pierced through her hysteria. Beatrice's mouth snapped shut. Her shoulders slumped instantly. The vicious monster who had terrorized me for my entire childhood suddenly shrank into a frail, terrified, and utterly broke older woman. She took a staggering step backward, practically hiding behind my father, who was still staring blankly at the floor in a state of total shock. I kept my eyes locked on her for a few more seconds to ensure she thoroughly understood her complete defeat. Then, without breaking my strong posture, I reached my hand behind me toward the stairs. I felt Zuri's small, trembling hand reach down and grab onto my fingers. I squeezed her hand tightly, silently promising her that she was perfectly safe, that she was beautiful, and that these broken people would never be allowed to hurt her again. I turned my head slightly and looked up at the top of the stairs. I kept my voice incredibly soft and steady, speaking only to Zuri. I told her to go back to her room, put on her favorite movie, and lock her door until I came upstairs. She looked at me, her dark eyes still filled with tears, but she nodded slowly. She trusted me completely. I watched her turn around and disappear down the hallway. I waited until I heard the firm click of her bedroom door locking shut. Only then did I turn back to face the wreckage of my family. The emotional part of the evening was entirely over. The time for screaming and crying had passed. Now it was time for the final execution. I walked back toward the kitchen island, my footsteps echoing sharply against the hardwood floor. I picked up the thick manila folder Julian had provided and tapped it deliberately against the marble counter. The sharp, rhythmic sound made my father flinch. I looked at Roland. He was staring at me, as if he were seeing me for the very first time in his life. The imposing, untouchable patriarch who had dictated my every move was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, hollowed-out old man. I told my father that I was going to make this incredibly simple for them. I explained that I was offering them one single chance to avoid dying in a federal penitentiary. I laid out the exact terms of their surrender. I instructed my father and mother that they had exactly 24 hours to legally capitulate. I told them that tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock, they were going to walk into my attorney's office in downtown Atlanta. They were going to sit down at the mahogany conference table, and they were going to sign a full uncontested relinquishment of the family trust. Every single remaining asset, the absolute deed to this house, and whatever pathetic scraps of legal authority they thought they still held, would be transferred solely and permanently into my name. My father opened his mouth, likely to protest the timeline, but I held up my hand and cut him off instantly. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cold, measured precision of a federal investigator reading a suspect their rights. I pointed to my laptop screen, which was still glowing brightly with their forged signatures and fraudulent bank transfers. I told my parents that if they were even 1 minute late to that appointment, the deal was instantly revoked. If they tried to call any of their expensive country club lawyers to negotiate, the deal was revoked. If they hesitated for a single second before signing their names on the dotted line, I would walk straight outside and hand the unredacted financial ledgers directly to the federal agents waiting in the patrol cars. I made sure they understood exactly what they were facing. I listed the federal charges out loud, letting each one hang heavily in the air. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud, receiving and laundering stolen federal funds, aiding and abetting grand larceny. I looked my father dead in the eye and promised him that federal prosecutors do not offer lenient plea deals to arrogant men who fund fraudulent tech startups with stolen money. Roland raised a shaking hand. His booming, authoritative voice was reduced to a pathetic, ragged whisper. He asked me how they were supposed to survive. He pointed a trembling finger toward Connor and reminded me that they had given all their money to him. My father's eyes filled with desperate tears as he realized the absolute totality of his ruin. He told me that if they signed over the trust and gave me the house, they would have absolutely nothing left to their names. They would be homeless. He tried to appeal to my sense of family duty, asking if I was really cold enough to leave my own parents destitute in their old age. I stared at him, searching my heart for even a single ounce of pity. I found absolutely nothing. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel small, and I told him he should have thought about his retirement before he banked it on a toxic elitist fantasy. I told him he made his choice when he decided to protect Connor and Jamal, instead of protecting his own daughter. I reminded him that just 10 minutes ago he was perfectly willing to throw me out into the street and steal my child just to protect his fake image of success. I told him that karma had finally arrived at his doorstep, and she was demanding full payment. I turned my attention to the rest of the room. I made deliberate eye contact with every single one of them. Jamal, who was trembling violently on the sofa, realizing his manipulation tactics were entirely useless. Jasmine, who was weeping uncontrollably on the floor, mourning the loss of her luxury cars and her perfect social standing. Connor, who was staring blankly at his cracked phone, realizing he was going to federal prison. And finally, my mother Beatrice, who was cowering behind my father, completely stripped of her venom and her pride. I checked my watch. I told them they had exactly 5 minutes to get out of my house. I ordered them to pick up their coats, walk out my front door, and never step foot on my property ever again. I told my parents I would see them at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and if I did not, the police would see them at 10. Nobody argued. Nobody threatened me. The absolute silence of their defeat was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. My father slowly reached out and grabbed my mother's arm, pulling her toward the entryway. They moved like ghosts, their shoulders slumped, their entire world completely destroyed by the very lies they had built it upon. The heavy oak front door clicked shut, sealing the cool night air outside. My parents were gone. A few seconds later, Connor grabbed Jasmine by the arm and dragged her out the same door, both of them practically tripping over themselves in their rush to escape the federal nightmare they had just woken up in. Neither of them looked back. Neither of them said goodbye. They did not even glance at the man who had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund their lavish lifestyle. They simply vanished into the dark, leaving Jamal entirely isolated. I stood in the foyer, breathing in the sudden peaceful quiet of my own home. I looked over at the police officer and Julian, giving them a small, silent nod of gratitude. Now that the parasites had been purged from my house, my only priority was going upstairs to hold my daughter and assure her the worst was over. I turned on my heel and walked toward the hallway that led to the main staircase. I did not even make it to the first step before a hand weakly grabbed the fabric of my cardigan. I stopped and looked down. It was Jamal. He had followed me from the living room. The arrogant, condescending husband who had confidently accused me of grand larceny just an hour ago was completely gone. In his place was a pathetic, trembling shell of a man. As soon as I made eye contact with him, he executed a flawless theatrical pivot. Jamal collapsed. He literally dropped to his knees right there on the hallway runner, his hands desperately clutching at the hem of my sweater. He forced water into his eyes. Working as a federal investigator, I sit across from guilty people every single day. I know exactly what genuine remorse looks like, and I know what cornered panic looks like. I watched Jamal physically contort his face to mimic absolute devastation. He let out a loud, ragged sob that echoed off the hallway walls, trying to sound like a man broken by circumstances entirely beyond his control. He looked up at me, tears spilling perfectly down his cheeks, and began the most disgusting performance of the entire night. He started speaking rapidly, his voice choked with manufactured emotion. He told me I had to listen to him. He swore on his life that none of this was his idea. He pointed a trembling finger toward the front door and blamed the entire criminal enterprise on Connor. Jamal cried that Connor had viciously manipulated him. He claimed that the wealthy white brother-in-law had preyed on his insecurities and his desperate desire to be a good, successful provider for me and Zuri. He spun a ridiculous narrative, insisting that Connor had orchestrated the entire insurance fraud scheme, handled all the money, and simply used Jamal as a blind, trusting pawn. Jamal tightened his grip on my sweater, pulling himself slightly upward. He lowered his voice, shifting his tactic from frantic excuses to deep, calculated emotional manipulation. Since his wealth and his in-laws could no longer protect him, he tried to tap into the very core of my identity. He looked at me with those wide, tear-filled eyes and tried to weaponize our shared heritage. He reminded me of the statistics. He talked about the racial disparities in the federal justice system. He said the courts were designed to destroy men who looked like him and that the investigators would not care about the nuance of his situation. He pleaded with me, telling me that I knew exactly what federal prison did to black men. He begged me to use my federal clearance to retract my statement to the insurance bureau and delete the files. Jamal actually had the audacity to look me in the eye and say, "You cannot let the system take down a black man. We have to stick together, Chloe. Do it for our family. Do it for us." I looked down at the man kneeling at my feet. The sheer hypocrisy of his words was staggering. He was actively weaponizing the very real systemic trauma of our community, using it as a convenient shield to protect himself from the consequences of his own greed. It was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. He did not care about the justice system. He did not care about the struggles of his community. He only cared about saving his own skin, and he was willing to exploit my empathy as a black woman to get exactly what he wanted. I looked down at his hands clutching the fabric of my sweater. I told him to let go of me. When he hesitated, playing the role of the broken husband, I yanked the fabric away with enough force to make him stumble forward onto the hardwood floor. I took a step back, keeping my posture rigid. I kept my voice low, but every single word was coded in absolute freezing disgust. I asked him how he dared to kneel in my hallway and invoke the struggles of our community to save himself. I pointed a steady finger toward the foyer, where Julian was standing silently next to the police officer. I reminded Jamal that he had absolutely no problem feeding another innocent black man to that exact same justice system when it benefited him. Jamal did not care about systemic trauma when he was standing in a federal courtroom, lying under oath and framing his own business partner. He gladly watched Julian get hauled away in handcuffs just so he could steal a massive insurance payout and secretly fund his arrogant, wealthy white brother-in-law's lifestyle. I told Jamal his sudden, desperate sense of racial solidarity was nothing but a pathetic, cowardly illusion meant to manipulate my empathy. Jamal opened his mouth to launch into another string of desperate excuses, but I stopped him completely. I reached into the deep pocket of my cardigan and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked it and turned the bright screen directly toward his face. The red recording timer was blinking steadily, in the center of the display, tracking the minutes that had passed since my parents walked out the door. I had pressed record the exact second Jamal followed me into the hallway. I watched his eyes lock onto the glowing red numbers. The manufactured tears completely stopped. I told him I did not just listen to his pathetic plea for mercy. I recorded every single syllable of it. I informed him that in his rush to blame Connor and beg for my help, he had just given a clear, voluntary, and fully articulate verbal confession to perjury, wire fraud, and the deliberate framing of an innocent man. He had explicitly admitted that the robbery was fake and that he knew the money was stolen. I smiled down at him and told him he had just handed the federal prosecutors a beautifully wrapped gift. Jamal stared at the glowing screen as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. The facade of the loving, desperate husband completely vanished, replaced by a hollow, breathless shock. He realized he had walked right into the trap. He thought he could isolate me in the hallway and manipulate my emotions completely, underestimating the fact that a forensic investigator never stops gathering evidence. Jamal slumped back against the wall, his head dropping heavily into his hands. He was entirely finished. Before I could call the officer over to collect the phone and log the digital confession, the heavy front door flew open once again, slamming violently against the interior wall. Jasmine marched back into the foyer. She was no longer crying on the floor. Her panic had been replaced by a frantic, calculated, and entirely selfish rage. Connor was trailing right behind her, looking utterly exhausted, his expensive clothes disheveled. Jasmine stomped past the police officer, ignored Julian, and marched right up to the edge of the hallway, where Jamal and I were standing. She was clutching a thick stack of legal documents in her manicured hands. Jasmine waved the papers aggressively in the air, the pages rustling loudly in the quiet house. She loudly announced to the room that she was absolutely not going down with a sinking ship. She declared that she had kept these emergency divorce papers drafted for months, just in case Connor's tech startup ever went under. She stated with absolute arrogant certainty that she was legally separating from him tonight. My sister looked around the room, demanding our attention as she laid out her brilliant survival plan. She told us she was going to file for an emergency legal injunction tomorrow morning to completely sever their finances. She proudly claimed that by filing the papers immediately, she was going to shield her personal bank accounts, her luxury vehicles, and her trust fund from the Securities and Exchange Commission asset freeze. She looked at Connor with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt and told him he was entirely on his own. She said she refused to let his criminal incompetence ruin the perfect lifestyle she was entitled to. A heavy, incredibly tense silence settled over the foyer. And then Connor started to laugh. It did not start as a simple chuckle. It was a dark, hysterical, completely unhinged laugh that bubbled up from the depths of his ruined chest. He leaned against the console table, throwing his head back, laughing so hard that actual tears formed in the corners of his eyes. The sound was deeply unsettling. Jasmine slowly lowered the divorce papers, staring at him, as if he had completely lost his mind. She demanded to know what was so funny about her leaving him destitute. Connor slowly caught his breath, wiping his face with the back of his hand. He looked at his beautiful, arrogant wife with a smile that was entirely devoid of sanity. He told Jasmine she was more than welcome to file the divorce papers. He highly encouraged her to do it. But then he tilted his head and told her she was severely mistaken about what she was actually protecting. Connor explained that when his venture capital funding completely dried up 2 years ago, his corporate lawyers required a guarantor with clean credit and unencumbered assets to secure a series of desperate emergency loans. Connor smiled a vicious, predatory smile. He reminded Jasmine of all those times she complained about reading boring corporate documents. He reminded her of how she would blindly sign massive stacks of paperwork at the kitchen table just so she could get back to planning her country club luncheons. Jasmine's face went completely blank. Her hands began to tremble. Connor revealed that because she never bothered to read a single page she signed, she had absolutely no idea what she was actually agreeing to. He proudly announced that he had legally structured the startup so that all the corporate debt, the massive federal tax liabilities, and the fraudulent loans were registered entirely in her name. He had made her the primary financial guarantor of the entire fraudulent enterprise. Connor laughed again, the sound echoing harshly off the walls. He told Jasmine she had absolutely no assets left to protect because she held all of the company's liability. He looked her dead in the eye and told her that when the federal agents seized the accounts tomorrow, they were not just coming for his business. They were coming for her trust fund, her designer clothes, her cars, and every single penny she would ever earn for the rest of her natural life. The thick stack of divorce papers slipped from Jasmine's hands, fluttering uselessly to the hardwood floor. The sheer gravity of her complete financial annihilation hit her all at once. Her knees buckled slightly, and she stood in the foyer like a hollow statue, realizing she was permanently and legally tethered to the massive mountain of debt created by the man who had just destroyed her. Jasmine stood completely frozen in the center of the foyer, staring blankly at the divorce papers scattered across the hardwood floor. Connor's cruel, hysterical laughter finally died down, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. He had just gleefully admitted to binding his own wife to massive corporate debt and federal tax liabilities. He had practically bragged about his financial manipulation right in front of a sworn police officer. The officer standing near the entryway did not need to wait another second. He had patiently observed this entire chaotic unraveling, remaining composed while my family tore themselves apart. Now he had all the probable cause he would ever need. The officer reached up and unclipped the radio from his shoulder. He requested immediate backup to our address, citing multiple felony suspects, active confessions to grand larceny and interstate wire fraud. His voice was incredibly calm and professional, a sharp, devastating contrast to the absolute panic that was suddenly consuming the men in my house. Julian walked over to the officer and silently handed him the thick manila folder containing all the unredacted bank ledgers, offshore routing numbers, and forged trust documents. I stepped forward and held out my unlocked cell phone. The audio recording of Jamal's full, tearful confession to perjury and insurance fraud was paused on the screen, ready to be processed as state evidence. Jamal watched the exchange from his position slumped against the hallway wall. He watched the officer take my phone, and the last remaining ounce of fight completely left his body. He did not try to run. He did not try to argue or launch into another pathetic string of excuses. He slowly slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, burying his face in his hands. The officer walked over to him, firmly, ordered him to stand up, and told him to put his hands behind his back. Jamal complied silently, moving like a man walking to his own execution. The heavy metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the quiet hallway was the most beautiful, satisfying sound I had heard in over a decade. My husband, the man who had lied to my face, stolen my inheritance, and sent an innocent friend to a concrete cell just to buy my parents' approval, was finally in chains. In the distance, the faint, piercing wail of approaching sirens broke through the quiet night air. The sound grew louder and more aggressive by the second, signaling the absolute end of the road. When Connor heard those sirens, the smug, arrogant tech founder persona completely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. He looked at Jamal standing in handcuffs. He looked at the flashing red and blue lights that were just beginning to reflect against the front living room windows. The sheer terrifying reality of a federal prison sentence finally crashed down on him. Connor panicked. He did not surrender with the pathetic, quiet resignation of my husband. Instead, the man who had just bragged about having high-powered lawyers on speed dial turned on his heel and bolted like a frightened animal. He sprinted past Jasmine, violently shoved a heavy wooden dining chair out of his way, and ran frantically through the kitchen toward the back door. The officer immediately shouted for him to stop, dropping a hand to his utility belt, but Connor was already twisting the deadbolt. He burst out onto the back patio, sprinting wildly across the dark lawn, blindly hoping he could jump the tall wooden fence and disappear into the night. He did not even make it halfway across the grass. The backup units had already arrived, silently flanking the perimeter of the property while the sirens blared out front. Just as Connor reached the edge of the manicured lawn, two uniformed officers rounded the corner of the house. They did not hesitate or issue a warning. They tackled Connor at full speed. The impact was violent and immediate. The wealthy, entitled tech genius hit the ground hard, his face pressing directly into the damp soil. I walked over to the kitchen window and watched the spectacle under the bright security floodlights. The officers quickly pinned his arms behind his back. Connor began thrashing and screaming, his voice cracking hysterically as he demanded they let him go. He was loudly threatening to sue the entire police department, screaming about his rights and his angel investors. His expensive custom-tailored fleece vest was covered in mud and torn at the shoulder. He looked absolutely pathetic. The officers dragged Connor to his feet, securing the handcuffs tightly around his wrists. They marched him roughly around the side of the house toward the front driveway, right as the primary officer was escorting Jamal out the front door. I walked out onto the front porch, wrapping my cardigan tightly against the cool evening breeze. The scene unfolding on my quiet street was a masterpiece of poetic justice. 4 police cruisers were parked diagonally across my driveway and the street. Their light bars were spinning wildly, casting harsh red and blue shadows across the pristine lawns and perfectly trimmed hedges. The commotion had drawn the attention of the entire neighborhood. Front doors were opening up and down the street. My wealthy, status-obsessed neighbors were stepping out onto their porches in their pajamas and evening wear, holding their phones and whispering furiously to one another. For years, these people had looked at Jamal and Connor as the absolute epitome of success. My parents had paraded these 2 men around at neighborhood barbecues and holiday parties, bragging endlessly about their corporate achievements and their flawless, affluent marriages. Now the entire neighborhood was watching the devastating truth unfold under the glare of police floodlights. They watched Jamal, the brilliant, successful entrepreneur, walk out of his own home with his head hung in utter disgrace. He refused to make eye contact with anyone. His shoulders slumped in defeat as an officer pressed a hand to the back of his head and shoved him into the back of a squad car. Right behind him came Connor. There was absolutely no quiet dignity in his arrest. He was crying openly, a complete mess of dirt, grass stains, and sheer terror. He was limping slightly from the tackle, still shouting empty, desperate threats about his lawyers to officers who completely ignored him. The neighbors watched in stunned, breathless silence as the wealthy old money tech founder was aggressively patted down and forced into the back of a second cruiser. I stood on the porch with Julian standing quietly right beside me. We watched the heavy doors of the police cruisers slam shut, trapping the monsters inside. Julian looked at me, a deep, unspoken understanding passing between us. He had lost 3 years of his life to their greed, and I had lost over a decade to their lies. But tonight, the scales were finally balanced. The cruisers shifted into gear and rolled slowly down the street, taking the absolute trash out of my life forever. The flashing lights of the police cruisers faded into the darkness at the end of the block, but the neighborhood remained entirely awake. Up and down the street, front doors were wide open. The wealthy, status-obsessed neighbors my parents had spent years trying to impress were standing on their manicured lawns, holding their phones up, actively recording the absolute destruction of our family's pristine facade. Julian gave me a small, silent nod of respect and quietly walked past me into the house, giving me the space to finish what was left. I stood alone on the edge of my front porch and looked down at the 3 people stranded on my grass. My father, Roland, looked like a hollowed-out shell of a human being. He was staring blankly at the empty street where Connor's cruiser had just disappeared. His hands hung limply at his sides. He was a man who had spent his entire life measuring his worth by the balance of his bank accounts and the prestige of his exclusive country club memberships. Tonight, both of those things had been permanently erased. He did not have a single dollar to his name, and his reputation in this elite neighborhood was completely obliterated. The men he used to golf with were currently watching him stand in my front yard like a vagrant. A few feet away, my older sister Jasmine was sitting directly on the damp grass, completely ruining her expensive silk designer dress. She had her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, rocking back and forth. She was staring at her luxury sports utility vehicle parked in my driveway, slowly realizing that the federal government was going to seize it by the end of the week. The reality of the massive corporate debt Connor had maliciously strapped to her name was short-circuiting her brain. She had spent 32 years believing she was fundamentally superior to me, simply because she had lighter skin and married a wealthy white man. Now she was a broke, publicly humiliated woman, facing millions of dollars in federal tax liabilities, and she was entirely alone. But it was my mother, Beatrice, who finally broke the heavy silence. She slowly turned away from the street and looked up at me standing on the porch. The vicious, snarling monster who had screamed at my daughter just 30 minutes ago was completely gone. The arrogant matriarch who had tried to legally throw me out of my own house had vanished. In her place stood a terrified, desperate older woman who suddenly realized she had absolutely nowhere to go. Beatrice took a hesitant step toward the porch. Her perfectly styled hair was beginning to fall flat in the cool night humidity. She looked at me, and to my absolute disgust, she began to cry. These were not angry tears. They were the pathetic, heavy tears of a manipulator who had run out of victims and run out of leverage. She walked up to the bottom step of the porch and reached a trembling hand out toward me. Her voice cracked as she spoke, adopting the tone of a frightened, helpless mother. She told me that their bank accounts were already frozen because of the active federal investigation into Connor's company. She said they could not even afford to book a cheap hotel room for the night. She looked at the large, warm house behind me and begged me to let them come inside. Beatrice actually clasped her hands together and looked up at me with pleading eyes. She told me that the world was being cruel to them, and that they had made some terrible mistakes, but that we had to stick together now, more than ever. She used the exact same manipulative tactic Jamal had tried to use in the hallway. She attempted to weaponize my empathy, crying out that I was her daughter, that she had carried me, and that I could not leave my own flesh and blood out in the cold. She said family takes care of family, and demanded that I take them in. I looked down at her outstretched hands. I did not move a single muscle. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt, sadness, or obligation. I just felt an overwhelming sense of crystal clear clarity. I kept my voice perfectly level and projected it just enough so my father and sister could hear every single word. I asked my mother where that exact sentiment was an hour ago. I asked her where her fierce dedication to family was when she handed my innocent, beautiful 13-year-old daughter a jar of toxic skin bleaching cream and told her she was too dark to be loved. My mother flinched as if I had physically struck her, lowering her hands to her chest. I did not stop. I asked her where her loyalty to family was when she and my father willingly bankrupted themselves to fund Connor's fake startup while actively covering up the fact that my husband had stolen my private inheritance. I reminded her that less than an hour ago she had stood in my kitchen and proudly declared that I was a bitter, vindictive snake and an unfit mother. She had threatened to call Child Protective Services to steal my daughter and force me onto the street. I looked my mother dead in the eye and told her she did not get to burn my house down, and then begged me to let her sleep in the ashes. Beatrice let out a loud, pathetic wail. She dropped to her knees on the bottom step of the porch, grabbing the wooden railing. She cried that they were ruined. She sobbed that if I did not help them, they would be homeless by tomorrow morning. She begged me to show them the mercy they had never shown me. I told her that mercy is reserved for people who feel actual remorse, not for people who are only crying because they finally got caught. I reminded her of the absolute ultimatum I had given them in the kitchen. I told her that tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, she and my father were still legally required to sit in my attorney's office and sign over every remaining right they held to the family trust. I promised her that if she tried to use this pathetic display of tears to negotiate her way out of that agreement, I would make good on my threat and hand the unredacted ledgers directly to the federal prosecutors. Roland finally moved. He slowly walked over to the porch and put a hand on Beatrice's shoulder, trying to pull her up from the steps. He looked at me, his eyes entirely defeated. He did not ask for forgiveness. He knew there was none left to give. He just looked at me and asked what they were supposed to do tonight. I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world, the people who had spent my entire life making me feel like I was entirely unworthy of love. I told them they could do whatever they wanted. They could sleep in their car. They could go to a public shelter. They could go knock on the doors of their wealthy country club friends and see exactly how quickly high society turns its back on federal criminals. I told them their survival was no longer my responsibility. I took a step back from the edge of the porch, creating a permanent physical boundary between my safe, peaceful life and the absolute wreckage of theirs. I looked at Beatrice, who was still weeping into my father's shoulder, and I prepared to give her the only thing she was ever going to receive from me again. I turned away from this pathetic sight of my mother weeping into my father's shoulder. I walked across the wide expanse of my front porch and stepped back into the warmth of my foyer. The house was incredibly quiet now. The chaotic, violent energy that had filled these rooms just an hour ago was completely gone. Julian had already let himself out through the side door, leaving me entirely alone to finish this. I walked straight past the living room sofa where my husband had knelt and lied to my face. I walked into the kitchen. The bright overhead lights were still shining down on the marble island. Sitting right in the center of the counter was the dark blue velvet box. It was the exact same box my mother had handed to my beautiful, innocent daughter at the dinner table. I picked it up. The velvet felt cheap against my fingertips. I opened the lid. The heavy glass jar of toxic skin bleaching cream and the hateful colorless letter were still sitting inside. The false bottom where the stolen diamond pendant had been hidden was torn open and empty. I took the jar of cream and the folded cardstock and threw them directly into the garbage can. I held the empty velvet box in my hand. It was incredibly light now. It weighed absolutely nothing, just like my mother's authority. I gripped the small box, tightly turned around, and walked back through the hallway toward the open front door. My parents were still standing at the bottom of the porch steps. They had not moved a single inch. When my mother heard my footsteps on the wooden porch boards, she lifted her head from my father's shoulder. Her mascara was smeared across her cheeks, and her face was puffy. For a brief, pathetic second, a glimmer of hope flashed in her eyes. She actually thought I had gone inside to grab my car keys to write her a check, or to finally tell her to come inside out of the cold. She genuinely believed that the lifelong bond of family obligation had finally broken my resolve. I walked slowly down the wooden steps until I was standing on the exact same level as her. I did not give her a chance to speak or beg again. I reached out and shoved the empty blue velvet box directly into the center of my mother's chest. Beatrice gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to grab the small box before it could fall to the ground. She looked down at it, confused, her trembling fingers brushing over the broken brass padlock. She looked back up at me, her bloodshot eyes searching my face for an explanation. I stared into the eyes of the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like I was a mistake. I thought about the decades of subtle insults, the blatant favoritism she had constantly showered on my sister, and the suffocating pressure to be someone I was not. And then I thought about the moment she looked at my perfect, dark-skinned daughter and tried to pass that exact same generational trauma down to her. I leaned in close, ensuring my voice was the only thing she could hear over the distant hum of the neighborhood. I spoke with a quiet, lethal finality. I told her that earlier tonight she had handed this box to Zuri. I reminded her that she had patted my daughter on the shoulder and told her it was time she learned her place in this family. I looked my mother dead in the eye and delivered my final sentence. Now you learn yours. Beatrice's mouth parted, but no sound came out. Her hands shook violently around the empty velvet box. The absolute crushing reality of her new place in the world finally settled over her like a heavy shroud. She was no longer the matriarch. She was no longer superior. She was nothing more than a bankrupt, broken woman standing on the lawn of the daughter she had severely underestimated. I did not wait for a response. I did not need one. I turned my back on her and my father. I walked up the wooden steps of the porch, my posture perfectly straight, my head held high. I crossed the threshold into my home and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the solid oak front door. I looked at them one last time. They looked incredibly small standing there in the dark. I pulled the door shut. The heavy wood closed with a deep, solid thud, entirely cutting off the view of the street, the flashing police lights, and the broken people who had tried to destroy me. I reached up and turned the heavy brass deadbolt. The loud metallic click echoed through the silent foyer. It was the sound of a permanent boundary sliding into place. It was the sound of absolute safety. I stood in the entryway for a long moment, simply breathing. The suffocating weight I had carried in my chest for 35 years was completely gone. I was not the bitter sister. I was not the difficult daughter. I was the absolute master of my own life. I turned away from the locked door, walked over to the bottom of the staircase, and looked up toward the second floor. It was time to go upstairs, hold my daughter, and tell her that we were finally free. 6 months have passed since the heavy brass deadbolt clicked into place, sealing the toxicity out of my life forever. The federal justice system moves incredibly slowly for some people, but when a senior forensic accountant hands them a perfectly documented, airtight case of interstate wire fraud, the gears turn with terrifying efficiency. I sat in the gallery of the federal courthouse last month and watched the final verdicts come down. It was a beautiful, deeply satisfying conclusion to a nightmare I never asked to be a part of. Jamal stood before the federal judge wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, completely stripped of his tailored suits, his arrogant posture, and his silver tongue. The judge did not care about his pathetic excuses or his attempts to play the victim. When the sentence was read, Jamal visibly buckled. He was given 10 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He turned around before the bailiff led him away, his eyes scanning the gallery, desperately looking for a single sympathetic face. I just looked back at him with absolute indifference until he was marched through the heavy wooden side doors, entirely erased from my future. Connor tried to fight his charges, fully expecting his old money family to swoop in and save him with a team of high-powered defense attorneys. But wealth in his world is heavily dependent on reputation. His family was absolutely disgusted by the public embarrassment of the federal raid on his fake startup. They legally disowned him, cut him off from his trust fund, and completely refused to pay a single dollar for his legal defense. The arrogant tech genius, who used to brag about his untouchable status, was assigned an overworked public defender. He ended up taking a miserable plea deal that landed him in the exact same federal cell block as my former husband. The collateral damage was just as satisfying to watch. Jasmine did not get her emergency divorce injunction. The Securities and Exchange Commission froze every single asset she had ever touched. They auctioned off her luxury sports utility vehicles, seized her massive mansion, and liquidated her entire designer wardrobe to pay restitution. Today, the golden child sister who once looked down on me for working with spreadsheets is working double shifts at a discount retail store. She spends her days standing on her feet, folding cheap clothes and dealing with angry customers just to make the minimum monthly payments on her massive federal tax debt. She takes the public bus to work, entirely invisible to the high society circles she once ruled with such cruel entitlement. And then there are my parents. Beatrice and Roland lost the house I took back, and since they had blindly given their entire retirement to Connor, they were left with absolutely nothing. They were forced to move into a tiny run-down one-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. The linoleum floors are peeling, the plumbing rattles loudly in the walls, and the view from their single window is a cracked parking lot. But the financial ruin was not what truly broke my mother. It was the social execution. When the messy details of the fraud and the stolen money went public, my parents became instant pariahs. Their elite country club revoked their membership immediately via a cold, formalized email. Their prestigious church quietly asked them to stop attending Sunday services, not wanting the public stain of federal criminals sitting in the front pews. My mother can no longer host her lavish brunches or look down her nose at anyone. She and my father are completely isolated, living out their final years trapped in the exact type of poverty and utter obscurity they spent their entire lives running away from. While their world burned to the absolute ground, mine was finally allowed to flourish. Julian was fully exonerated. His record was expunged, and the federal government issued a massive multi-million-dollar settlement for his wrongful conviction. But instead of taking the money and disappearing to a quiet island, Julian did exactly what he promised he would do. He opened a highly specialized elite financial auditing firm in a beautiful glass building in downtown Atlanta. His very first executive decision was hiring me as his lead partner. We spend our days dismantling corrupt corporations, tracing hidden assets, and exposing the exact type of arrogant, manipulative men who try to destroy us. My career is no longer a secret I have to hide to protect a fragile man's ego. My name is painted in bold letters on the frosted glass of my corner office door. I am highly respected, incredibly well paid, and entirely in control of my own destiny. But the greatest victory of all is not the money, the title, or even the revenge. It is the peace. It is a quiet Sunday morning in my home, completely free from the toxic expectations, the thinly veiled insults, and the exhausting demands of a family dinner. I am standing in the doorway of my daughter's bedroom, holding a warm cup of coffee, just watching her. Zuri is standing in front of her vanity mirror, getting ready for the day. She is not crying. She is not trying to shrink herself, hide her features, or be anything other than exactly who she is. Zuri is confidently brushing out her beautiful, thick, natural hair, a bright, genuine smile illuminating her flawless, dark skin. And resting perfectly against her collarbone, catching the bright morning sunlight pouring through the window, is the heavy platinum and diamond pendant. After the trial concluded and the insurance bureau settled the accounts, the federal court legally released the necklace back to me as the rightful owner of the estate's remaining assets. It is no longer a piece of stolen evidence, and it is no longer a symbol of my husband's twisted lies. It is legally, rightfully ours. I take a sip of my coffee and smile. As I watch the diamonds glitter brilliantly around my daughter's neck, I know with absolute certainty that she will never have to learn her place in anyone else's shadow. She already knows her immense worth, and the strength we built from the ashes of their betrayal is absolutely unbreakable. The greatest lesson I learned from this nightmare is that blood simply makes you related, but respect and loyalty are what truly make a family. For years, I stayed silent to keep the peace, believing that if I just shrank myself enough, they would eventually love me. I was wrong. Toxic people do not change when you give them more of your light because they only use it to cast darker shadows. True freedom begins the exact moment you stop seeking validation from those committed to breaking you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for your children and yourself is to firmly lock the door and never look back. If you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace, please share your story in the comments below and hit the subscribe button for more videos about reclaiming your power.